can you tell us a bit about the characters in The Amazing Tale of Ali Pasha?
Well, the main character is Henry Friston, who was a very young sailor. I think he was 18 years old when he sailed in HMS Implacable to Gallipoli and took part in the landings there. But I met Henry when he was a much older man in the Second World War, when I was a small boy growing up in the village shop. And Henry was a bus driver, and the buses from the town would turn around at our village shop and they'd have a 10-minute break to allow the driver and the conductress to come in for a cup of tea. And so in that way I got to meet Henry. And the shop was always full of soldiers and sailors who'd come to our village from all over the country to do their last bit of training on our cliffs before they went to invade Europe. And so Henry, the bus driver, would be surrounded by all these soldiers and sailors, and he would talk to them a little bit about his experiences as a sailor in the First World War. And I always liked scribbling, drawing on bits of paper, usually paper from biscuit tins, drawing soldiers and sailors and so forth. And Henry said he had a son, exactly the same age as myself, and he loved drawing. So he wanted me to go home with him one day to meet his son, Don. And we went home on the bus, and Henry and the rest of the Friston family lived in a wonderful railway carriage, covered all over with creepers and roses, and in a lovely garden full of vegetables and really tall runner beams and so forth. And in the midst of this was a tortoise, having absolutely wonderful time. Everything it could dream of eating was there in this garden. And Henry said the tortoise was called Ali Pasha. And I thought, that's a strange name for a tortoise.
So can you tell us how Henry met Ali Pasha and what happened?
It was several years later. I just started going to art school. I was 15, and Don Friston came to the art school also, and so we went through our student years together up in the art school in Suffolk. And I would go home with Don quite often because I loved going to the railway carriage. And one day he showed me the box which Henry had had as a very young sailor. It's called a ditty box, and on those great battleships the crew was enormous and they had to share bunks. So there'd be one sailor in a bunk, have his kit, and he'd get out and the next sailor would get in, so it was one in, one out. And the only privacy they had would be these little boxes in which they could contain, they could keep family photographs, letters from home, etc. And in Henry's box was a diary. He kept a diary of his time in the Navy in the First World War. And Don let me read it, and I realised here was a story that's worth recording, and a story of stuff I'd love to draw, which is another big part of why I like to do books. I like to do the pictures. And it just seems such an exotic idea that this little boy from a tiny village in Suffolk ended up in this great adventure and came back with all things a tortoise. Henry lived until he was well into his 80s, and the tortoise Ali Pasha lived for another 10 years after that, looked after lovingly by Don. He bred lots of tortoises, and I think Ali Pasha had an absolutely wonderful time.
In the war in Gallipoli, what were the exact circumstances that led Henry to Ali Pasha the tortoise?
The morning when they had to make the big invasion onto the beaches, Henry was in charge of one of the rowing boats. It would be the last getting the soldiers onto the beach. Now, as a young chap, Henry's first job was a gardener. He left school at 13, and at 15 he joined the crew of a fishing ship. So he knew about landing onto the shores. So he was in charge of one of these boats, full of soldiers. They all piled into the water. Many were killed before they even got to the beaches. But Henry's job then for the next few weeks was to be a stretcher bearer, ferrying wounded soldiers from the battlefield down the cliffs into the small boats and out to the hospital ship, week after week. And it was a terrible ordeal, of course. But on one of these occasions, he was suddenly under heavy shell fire, and he dived for cover in a shell crater, and a shell rolled in beside him. But it wasn't a high explosive shell, it was a tortoise shell. And judging by the little legs waving about, there's a real live tortoise inside.
What was the significance finding this lone tortoise for Henry? How did the small animal help him?
Henry, of course, was a country boy, and he had bred rabbits, chickens, bantams, pigeons, all sorts. And earlier that day, he had seen the horse of a dispatch rider shot dead. He was very affected by the tremendous number of animal deaths there were. The dispatch rider ponies, also the mules used for carrying ammunition. Tremendous death toll amongst the animals used. And Henry was suddenly confronted by this tortoise. And he thought, this is one life maybe he could save. In the midst of all this madness, here's one little thing. In his backpack he had some tomatoes, squashed obviously by his tumbling into the pit. And he got these out and he put them in front of the tortoise. The tortoise, of course, had withdrawn his head inside the shell. Henry wished that he had a shell he could withdraw into also. But he left the tortoise, the tomatoes there. His friends with him were calling, Henry, where are you? Come on, we've got to get on with the job. So Henry covered the tortoise with some straw to protect it from the sun, left it there and went on with his duties. And a few hours later came back, retraced his steps, and the tortoise was still there under its covering. So Henry put him in his backpack, took him back to HMS Implacable. Of course, you're not allowed to have pets on board a battleship. And he had to confide in his fellow gunners. Henry was one of a three-man gun crew, and they agreed that they would conceal the tortoise in the gunwale of this big turret. And there he was for the rest of his time on Implacable.
What was it like writing and illustrating such a heartwarming and moving story?
It was, for me, a story I'd lived with since I was a small boy. And why it took me so long to do it, I really don't know. But gradually, I did several other books about the Second World War, about growing up in the Second World War, books about the First World War, and never touched on Gallipoli. And it's also rather a long book for me. Normally I do much shorter books with lots and lots of pictures. But this was quite a big story. And I needed to find a way of telling it in a way. Quite often, if I have an idea for a story which I think is bigger than I can handle, I call Michael Morpurgo on the telephone, and he takes it on and works with it, and we work with it together. But this one was so personal to me, to my family, to my friend Don and his family. I didn't want it to be taken off at any kind of tangent. I wanted it to be as close as possible to the thing. So I kept it and worked on it off and on between other books until I felt I had a shape in which I could do it.
Why is it still important to remember the Battle of Gallipoli?
I think it's important to remember each and every battle. What particularly I liked about, or attracted me about this, was the fact that the various components of the army came from all around the empire, from Australia, New Zealand, India, all over. And in the story, I've concentrated on Henry, the little boy in the village, looking at the world map in his schoolroom and dreaming of one day having such an adventure where he'd go to some of these places. And he was intrigued by all the bits of the world which were part of the empire back then. And at Gallipoli, all those bits came together in one collective endeavour. And I think the idea of that, plus the personal thing of the country boy meeting this tiny animal, and in the midst of it all, making sure he did his utmost to protect it, was a sort of very kind of touching, very personal bit amongst this huge event.
What did Henry's gun crew think of Ali Pasha?
Well, after a while, they thought it must be a lucky omen because our mascot, because they were still, sailing through it all so far unscathed, and it became a kind of little pact between them, a kind of a bit of comradeship that we will also help Henry protect this little creature, because it was a Turkish tortoise, one for the other side, and during the unofficial peace, at one point when the battles had been so horrendous, there was this fraternisation, there was a mixture, there was a kind of sharing of food and drink, and Henry and his colleagues realised that these chaps on the other side were also country boys, didn't want to be there, had no idea why they were there. The whole thing was a nonsense. And I think that's the kind of thing I'd like to put across in some of my books about conflict, is that it doesn't need to be like that.
Michael Foreman, thank you very much.